You open your eyes, and the first thing you notice is the cold, not the mild inconvenience of forgetting to close a window before bed. A deep, marrow-aching cold that claws through every layer of whatever you managed to drape over yourself last night. The ground beneath you is hard. Actual ground, actual rock, and dirt, and something that was definitely alive recently. There is no mattress. There is no pillow. There is no thermostat you can nudge up 2 degrees before drifting back to sleep. There is only the cold, the dark, and the distant sound of something large moving through the trees. Congratulations. You've made it to the Stone Age. Specifically, let's say the Upper Paleolithic, somewhere around 30,000 years ago, somewhere in what will one day become Europe. You've landed in the era of woolly mammoths, cave lions, cave bears, and people who were, by the way, just as intelligent as you, but who spent literally every waking hour of every single day doing things that would reduce most modern people to a trembling mess within the first 48 hours. Now I know what you're thinking. You've watched survival shows. You've seen the videos of people building huts from scratch and catching fish with their bare hands. You once made a campfire on a hiking trip, and it only took you 45 minutes and an entire box of matches. You're resourceful. You've got grit. You could handle this. No, you really couldn't. And over the next 20,000 words or so, I'm going to walk you through exactly why. Hour by hour, challenge by challenge, increasingly desperate realization by increasingly desperate realization, until you are deeply, profoundly grateful that you were born in an era of running water, antibiotics, and the ability to order hot food to your door without standing up. We're going to talk about the cold that could kill you before breakfast, the predators that saw humans as a perfectly reasonable menu option, the food situation, which was significantly worse than difficult, the water, the injuries, the social dynamics, the total absence of medicine, and approximately 47 other things that could end your Stone Age adventure before the sun goes down on day 1. By the end of this, you will never complain about a slow Wi-Fi connection again. Or at the very least, you'll complain about it with a deep, private appreciation for the miraculous complexity of the world that made it possible. So, let's begin. The sun is just starting to lighten the horizon. Something howled about 20 minutes ago, and you're not entirely sure it was a wolf. And you are genuinely, deeply, absolutely not prepared for what comes next. Chapter 1. The moment you wake up and immediately wish you hadn't. You're lying on the ground inside what your band of maybe 20 people loosely calls shelter. If you're lucky, that means a shallow cave or a rock overhang that keeps the worst of the wind off. If you're less lucky, and luck is the primary currency of Stone Age existence. It means a rough lean-to made of branches, animal hides, and ambitious thinking. The fire that was burning last night has burned down to faint embers. Nobody kept watch on it through the night because everyone was exhausted, and that was a mistake because you are now very, very cold. Here's the thing about cold that modern people tend to forget. It is not merely uncomfortable. Cold is a killer, and in the Stone Age, it is one of the most patient and persistent ones available. The human body begins to lose its ability to function properly when your core temperature drops below about 35 degrees Celsius. At that point, you start shivering uncontrollably, which is actually your body doing you a favor, generating heat through muscle movement. But shivering burns calories, and calories, as we will discuss at great length, are not something you have in abundance. As your temperature drops further, you get confused. Your coordination degrades. Your judgment goes. People with hypothermia make notoriously terrible decisions. They sometimes actually feel warm and start removing their clothing, which speeds the whole process up in the worst possible direction. At around 32 degrees Celsius core temperature, you lose consciousness. Not long after that, you die. And here's the part where your Stone Age morning gets really unpleasant. You don't have Gore-Tex. You don't have thermal base layers. You don't have the kind of sleeping bag that can keep you comfortable in -20 temperatures. What you have are animal hides, probably bison, deer, or horse, that have been scraped and processed to varying degrees of effectiveness by the people in your group. If you're a newcomer to this world, you haven't been conditioning your body over a lifetime of cold exposure the way your actual Paleolithic companions have. You feel the cold harder and faster and more dangerously. Your first task of the morning, before you eat, before you drink, before you do anything else, is to get that fire going again. Not get a fire going in the sense of finding some matches, not even a lighter. What you have is a fire starting kit, probably a bow drill setup, which involves spinning a wooden spindle against a fireboard using a bow to generate friction, creating an ember in a small notch in the wood, then carefully transferring that ember to a bundle of dry tinder and blowing it into a flame. Let's talk about how hard this is. Modern people with years of practice can get a bow drill fire going in 3 to 5 minutes under good conditions. You, a person who has spent your entire life in an environment where fire comes from a small plastic device you click with your thumb, are going to struggle. The wood has to be the right type, and not just any right type, but the right type and dry enough, which is a problem if the night was damp. Your hands are cold, which means you're fine motor. Control is degraded. The tinder bundle needs to be just right. Not too loose, not too dense, bone dry if possible. If you fail, and there's a very reasonable chance you will fail multiple times before you succeed, you will sit in the cold, breathing into your hands, watching your breath fog in the air, while your core temperature continues to drop, and your energy reserves continue to drain. The longer this takes, the harder everything else today becomes. And even once you have fire, you're not done. You need fuel. Dry fuel. Someone needs to go gather it, which means leaving the relative safety of the shelter and heading into the surrounding landscape. A landscape that, as we will discuss shortly, has opinions about your presence in it. Let's say, for the sake of optimism, that you get the fire going. You're warming up. The light is growing. The cold is becoming merely very unpleasant, rather than medically dangerous. And now your body delivers its next message. You are hungry. Not skipped lunch hungry. Not forgot to have breakfast hungry. You're the kind of hungry that comes from genuine caloric deficit, from days or weeks of a diet that provides what you need to survive, not what you want to feel comfortable, and rarely anything extra. Because here's the reality of Stone Age nutrition. It was feast and famine in the most literal sense. A successful hunt of a large animal like a mammoth or a bison meant your band had more food than they could eat in a day or two. It meant a period of genuine abundance, gorging on protein and fat, the most precious calories available, preserving what you could by drying or smoking it. That abundance might last a week, maybe 2, and then it was gone, and you were back to foraging. Berries, roots, tubers, whatever plants were in season, small animals if you were lucky enough to catch them. Surviving on far fewer calories than your incredibly active, incredibly physically demanding lifestyle required. The chronic mild hunger that Stone Age people likely experienced for significant portions of the year wasn't just unpleasant. It meant your body was constantly operating slightly below optimal. Your thinking was a little slower. Your reaction times were a little worse. Your immune system was a little less effective. Everything was just a little harder than it needed to be. And this morning, you are hungry. So what do you eat? If it's summer or early autumn, you might have options. There could be berries, nuts, wild plants within walking distance. But identifying those plants is not as simple as it looks. The Stone Age world is not a supermarket with labels. It is a landscape full of things that look edible and are not, things that look inedible and are, things that are fine in small quantities and deadly in large ones, and things that require specific preparation before they won't hurt you. Acorns, for instance, contain tannins that are genuinely toxic in sufficient quantities. They need to be leached with water before they're safe to eat. Raw elderberries will make you ill. A beautiful red mushroom might be dinner, or it might be your last meal in the most permanent sense. Getting this wrong isn't an academic exercise. It's a medical emergency. Here's where your Stone Age knowledge gap becomes truly dangerous. The people in your band have spent their entire lives, and their parents spent their lives, and their grandparents spent their lives learning this specific landscape. They know which plants are where, which ones fruit in which season, which ones are safe, and which ones will send you to the ground clutching your stomach. They have inherited generations of careful, hard-won knowledge about this exact place. You have watched some YouTube videos and read a book about foraging in a completely different biome. If it's winter, and it might well be winter, because the last ice age extended well into what we now call the Upper Paleolithic, and even the warmer periods of this era were significantly colder than modern European winters, then your plant options are drastically reduced. You're looking at roots, bark, the occasional small rodent if you can catch one, and stored food from better times if your band was organized enough to preserve some. The caloric math in winter is brutal. You're burning enormous amounts of energy just staying warm, and the food available to replace that energy is minimal. So your morning starts with cold, then fire-making difficulty, then hunger, and then the process of trying to address that hunger in a landscape that will absolutely kill you if you make the wrong choice. And we haven't even left camp yet. There's one more morning problem we need to address, and it's one that never shows up in survival fantasies. Water. You are thirsty. You need water. And getting safe water in the Stone Age is considerably more complicated than turning on a tap. The nearest water source, a river, a stream, a lake, might be close, might be far. Either way, you need to go to it. And on your way there, you need to think carefully about what else might also be going to it, because watering holes and riverbanks are the great equalizers of the prehistoric world. The mammoth comes to drink, and so does the cave lion that hunts the mammoth. The deer come to drink, and so does the wolf pack. You come to drink, and so does everyone else. Stone Age people weren't naive about this. They had developed patterns, routines, knowledge about when it was relatively safer to approach a water source and when it wasn't. They moved in groups, made noise to announce their presence, kept watch. You are a single person, new to this landscape, unfamiliar with the local rhythms of predator activity, with no real experience assessing the signs that something dangerous is nearby. We'll talk more about predators in detail shortly, but understand that even getting your morning drink was a calculated risk in the Paleolithic world. And then there's the water itself. Giardia, the intestinal parasite that turns a clean-looking mountain stream into a several-week nightmare of stomach cramps and diarrhea, was absolutely present in the Stone Age. It's ancient. It's been around for millions of years. A stream that looks crystal clear and perfectly safe can be loaded with it, particularly downstream of any area where animals defecate, which is basically everywhere. Other waterborne pathogens, Cryptosporidium, various bacteria, were equally present and equally invisible. Stone Age people had developed a degree of resistance and adaptation to their local water sources over generations. You have not. You are, from a microbial standpoint, a tourist. And the local microorganisms will make you pay for that tourist status. Boiling water kills these pathogens, which means water safety in the Stone Age was tied to fire. No fire, drink the water and hope for the best, or go thirsty. Have fire. You need a container to boil water in. A clay pot, a birch bark container, or the somewhat alarming technique of stone boiling, which involves heating stones in a fire and dropping them into a skin or bark container filled with water until the water boils. These are all skills with real learning curves. These are all things your band knows how to do, and you are still figuring out. So, morning. You are cold, you got the fire going eventually. You are hungry with limited options, and getting water was either a risk or a project. It's probably around 8 in the morning, and you are already exhausted. Congratulations on surviving the first 2 hours, Chapter 2. The Predators. Because the world actively wants to eat you. You are standing at the edge of the camp, and you have just heard something move in the undergrowth about 30 meters to your left. Not a rustle, not a small creature scurrying sound, something deliberate, something with weight behind it. You stop moving, you stop talking, you stop breathing almost. Let's talk about what was out there. The Upper Paleolithic megafauna of Europe and Asia is one of the most extraordinary collections of large dangerous animals ever to share a landscape with human beings. And understanding exactly what you were dealing with gives you an entirely new appreciation for the fact that our ancestors survived it at all. Start with the cave lion. Panthera leospelea was not a smaller, more manageable version of a modern African lion. It was larger, significantly larger. The biggest specimens were probably around 10 to 12% bigger than modern lions, which doesn't sound dramatic until you remember that modern lions are already large enough to kill a human being with minimal effort. Cave lions lived throughout Europe and northern Asia, and they appear in Paleolithic cave art frequently enough to suggest that people were absolutely aware of them and thought about them quite a lot. When ancient humans were painting animals on cave walls, they kept painting lions. Make of that what you will. Then there was the cave bear. Ursus spelaeus was enormous, bigger than any modern bear species, with a body mass that could reach 500 kilograms or more for large males. The name comes from the fact that cave bears genuinely used caves for hibernation, which meant that the same caves that humans used for shelter were also periodically occupied by sleeping cave bears. Waking a hibernating cave bear was one of those experiences that tended to be extremely brief and extremely final. Cave bear skeletons have been found in many of the same caves where human remains and artifacts are found. The competition for shelter was real and sometimes violent. Wolves. Not the cautious, mostly human-avoidant wolves of modern Europe, but wolves in genuinely large packs, in a landscape where they hadn't yet learned to be afraid of humans. Modern wolves are extremely wary of people because thousands of years of being hunted and persecuted have bred that wariness into them. Stone Age wolves had not yet received that memo. They were confident predators operating in a world where humans were simply one large mammal among many, not a dominant species to be avoided. Spotted hyenas ranged through Europe during this period. Modern spotted hyenas are considerably more dangerous than their reputation suggests. They're not just scavengers, they're highly effective hunters, capable of taking down wildebeest, and they're genuinely fearless around humans in areas where they haven't learned to be afraid. Paleolithic European hyenas were similar, and they competed directly with human bands for food and shelter. And then there were the things that were dangerous without being strictly predators. Woolly mammoths weighed up to 8 tons and had very little reason to be afraid of anything, including humans. Aurochs, the wild ancestor of domestic cattle, stood up to 2 meters at the shoulder and were notoriously aggressive. Woolly rhinoceros were heavily armored, grumpy, and had a horn designed for goring. Musk oxen were territorial and formidable. Bison could reach 1,000 kilograms and were perfectly capable of killing a human being through the simple application of their enormous body weight. You are a soft, relatively slow, relatively weak primate in a landscape full of all of this. You do not have a gun. You do not have a steel knife. You have a spear with a flint tip that you or someone in your band made, and possibly a knife of chipped stone, and your wits, which are currently somewhat degraded by cold and hunger and sleep deprivation. Here's what your Stone Age contemporaries understood viscerally from childhood that you absolutely do not. Every decision you make about movement through this landscape is a risk calculation. Where you go, when you go there, how many people go with you, how much noise you make, what signs you read in the environment before deciding to proceed. All of this is a constant low-level survival computation that experienced hunter-gatherers ran automatically, the way you unconsciously check traffic before crossing a street. You have not developed this computation. You're going to miss things. And some of those things have claws. Let's walk through a specific scenario. You need to gather firewood, which means moving away from camp into the surrounding woodland. Your companions would, ideally, go with you. Stone Age people understood that there was genuine safety in numbers. and almost never moved through risky terrain alone. But let's say you're alone for a moment, or with just one other person. You enter the tree line. The light changes. It's dimmer, more broken, harder to see clearly. Your vision, the primary sense you rely on for everything, is now compromised. What you don't know, because you haven't spent years learning to read this specific landscape, is that the depression in the ground about 50 meters ahead collects water, and large animals tend to visit it in the mornings. What you don't know is that there's been a recent mammoth kill nearby, and the scent is drawing scavengers. What you don't know is how to read the way the birds have gone quiet in a particular direction, which your experienced companions would instantly recognize as a sign that something large is moving through. You're walking through a landscape broadcasting constant information about what's in it, and you cannot read that information. You are, in the most literal sense, dangerously illiterate. Let's talk about what happens if you do encounter a predator, say a cave lion. What do you do? The honest answer is, it depends, and your odds are not great. Modern predator encounter advice varies wildly by species because different animals respond to different behaviors. Run from a cheetah and it chases you. Stand your ground and look large, and it often reconsiders. Make eye contact with a gorilla, and it reads it as aggression. Avoid eye contact, and it may lose interest. These are not intuitive rules. They are learned knowledge, acquired from generations of experience with specific species in specific contexts. Stone Age people had that knowledge for their specific predators. They knew the signs of a lion stalking versus a lion that had already eaten and wasn't particularly interested. They knew which predators were deterred by fire and which weren't, which ones could be frightened off by a group making noise, and which ones were persistent enough to require active defense. They knew where not to go at night and why, and they had the hard-won experience to execute the right response in the right situation without having to think it through from first principles in the 3 seconds available. You don't. You're going to see a cave lion, and you're going to have the exact same response that any modern person would have. When suddenly, confronted with an apex predator the size of a small car, you're going to panic. And panicking in front of a predator is, broadly speaking, not a survival strategy. The spear you're carrying is not the simple protection device it might appear to be. A thrusting spear with a stone tip can absolutely injure and potentially kill a large predator. But using it effectively requires skill, nerve, and the ability to drive it into a charging animal's body at precisely the right moment in precisely the right way. This is not something you do well on your first try. It is not something most people could do well, even after extensive training, because the training would involve practicing the technique. And the thing you're practicing on is a live, extremely motivated predator who has opinions about the situation. Stone Age hunters who faced large predators did so in coordinated groups, using practice techniques developed over lifetimes. They didn't wander solo into lion territory and hope for the best. The social structure of the band was, among other things, a survival mechanism. You were safer in a group not just because there were more spears, but because the people around you knew what they were doing, and you could follow their lead. Which brings up a point we'll return to throughout this video. Almost every individual survival skill of the Stone Age was embedded in social knowledge and social practice. The band wasn't just company. The band was, in many ways, your survival system. But let's not leave the predator question without addressing one more aspect of it that rarely comes up in survival discussions: the psychological dimension. Modern humans, even those who spend time outdoors, rarely experience genuine predator threat. The closest most people get is a warning sign in a national park or a news story about a bear encounter. We have completely lost the background level predator awareness that was a permanent feature of Paleolithic psychology. This matters because that awareness changes how you move, how you sleep, how you process the environment around you. Stone Age people slept lightly, in groups with fire between them and the darkness, because the darkness sometimes contained things that wanted to eat them. They didn't have the luxury of deep, undisturbed 8-hour sleeps. They had fragmented, alert sleep patterns interrupted by the sounds of the night and the need to maintain fire. This chronic sleep disruption was another drain on energy and cognitive function, adding to the cold, the hunger, the constant physical demands of daily life. You, who are already exhausted from a night of poor sleep on hard ground, are going to spend your first full day in the Stone Age in a state of growing, genuine, survival-grade anxiety about things that are actually out there, not invented threats, not irrational fears, real, present dangers that you are genuinely not equipped to handle. That anxiety has a cost. It burns energy, it degrades judgment, it makes the hunger worse, and the cold feels sharper. The predators of the Stone Age didn't just kill people physically, they shaped the entire psychology and social organization of human existence, and that shaping was necessary for survival. Arriving in that world without it is like arriving at a chess tournament having only ever played checkers. The board looks familiar, but the game is completely different. Chapter 3. Food, the never-ending emergency. You have survived the morning's cold, and the trip to the water source, and the walk through the trees, where something large was definitely watching you and chose, for reasons of its own, not to do anything about it today. It is now, let's say mid-morning. Your band is awake, the fire is going, and a discussion is happening, largely in gesture and a spoken language you don't understand, though you're picking up context from tone and direction, about where to go and what to do today. The central question, the organizing question of essentially every single day in the Stone Age is, what are we going to eat? And this, more than anything else, is where your Stone Age adventure would get truly, genuinely desperate. Let's start with the numbers. An active adult human being needs somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 calories per day to maintain body weight and function effectively. A hunter-gatherer living in a cold climate, performing physically demanding activities all day, every day, might need 3,000 to 4,000 calories per day. Now here's the thing about those calories. They don't just appear. Every single one of them has to be found, caught, or grown. And in the Paleolithic, growing wasn't an option. Agriculture doesn't exist yet. Won't exist for another 25,000 years or so. Everything you eat is something that was wild yesterday. The diet of Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherers has been studied fairly extensively through archaeological evidence, animal bones, plant remains, isotope analysis of human skeletal material. And what it shows is fascinating and genuinely impressive. These people were not starving all the time. When conditions were good and the band was effective, they ate remarkably well. Large game provided enormous amounts of high-quality protein and fat. Mammoths, bison, horses, and reindeer were all on the menu, and a single successful mammoth hunt could provide enough calories to sustain a band of 20 people for weeks. The problem is the when conditions were good part, and the when the band was effective part, and the finding, tracking, and killing an 8-ton woolly mammoth with stone-tipped spears part. Let's talk about hunting, because hunting in the Stone Age is so different from any modern conception of hunting that it barely deserves the same word. There are no rifles, there are no tree stands, there are no game cameras telling you where the animals are. There are no roads to drive to the hunting area and no truck to bring the animal home in. What you have is your body, your spears, the knowledge in your head, and the accumulated intelligence of everyone in your band. Tracking is the foundation of Paleolithic hunting, and it is genuinely one of the most complex cognitive skills that human beings have ever developed. Reading animal tracks, not just identifying them, but understanding their age, the speed and gait of the animal that made them, the direction it was heading, whether it was injured or healthy, how long ago it passed, is a sophisticated interpretive skill that takes years to develop. Expert trackers can reconstruct entire narratives from marks in the ground that most modern people wouldn't even notice. They can tell you that a bull mammoth passed here 2 days ago, moving northeast at a walk, slightly favoring its left forefoot, probably heading toward water given the season and the wind direction. You cannot do any of this. You can perhaps identify that something large has been through the area recently if the tracks are fresh and obvious. That's approximately where your tracking ability ends. This means that when your band splits up to search for game, your contribution to the tracking effort is essentially zero. You are the Stone Age equivalent of a person who shows up to help with a complex technical project and spends most of their time trying to stay out of the way while the experts work. The hunt itself, when game is found, is a coordinated effort. Different bands use different techniques depending on the landscape and the prey. Driving animals toward natural traps like cliffs or bogs, herding them into narrow passes where waiting hunters could attack. Using fire to direct animal movement, ambush hunting near water sources, or migration routes. All of these require coordination, planning, and precise execution. A mammoth drive, for instance, might involve 10 to 15 hunters working in coordinated roles across a large area with specific people responsible for specific positions and actions. Getting this wrong, breaking position too early, making the wrong sound at the wrong moment, panicking, and throwing your spear before the animal is in range doesn't just mean failure. It means spooking the prey and possibly getting someone killed in the resulting chaos. You don't know the plan. Even if someone tried to explain it to you, you don't speak the language well enough to understand the nuances. You're going to follow along and try to do what everyone else does, which means you're a potential liability, a moving piece that the experienced hunters have to account for when making their plans. And here's the other thing about large game hunting. It doesn't happen every day. Mammoths don't wander conveniently past your camp every morning. Bison herds follow seasonal migration patterns. Large game requires significant travel to find, time to track, and a successful hunt might happen once every several days to once every couple of weeks, depending on season and location. In between those hunts, you eat what you can gather. Gathering, for all that it tends to be treated as the less glamorous half of hunter-gatherer, is its own complex skill set with its own substantial learning curve. We touched on the identification problem earlier, knowing what's safe to eat. But there's also the question of where things are, when they're available, and how to process them. Take hazelnuts. Hazelnuts are excellent nutrition, high in fat, reasonably high in protein, decent calories per gram. They're also seasonal, available in autumn, and squirrels are absolutely competing with you for them. Finding a productive hazel grove requires knowing the landscape, knowing what to look for, knowing that this type of woodland in this kind of soil tends to support hazels, knowing that the hazels here fruited well last year and will probably fruit well this year. This isn't something you pick up in a day. This is landscape knowledge built over years. Root vegetables, tubers, bulbs, rhizomes, exist in the ground, invisible from the surface. Knowing which plants have edible roots, knowing which time of year the roots are at their most nutritious, knowing how to find them when the above-ground parts aren't visible, knowing how to prepare the ones that need preparation. This is all specialist knowledge. Your band's most experienced gatherers are basically walking encyclopedias of the local food landscape. You are a blank page. Insects are an excellent protein source, and your Stone Age contemporaries would have known which species were edible when they were available and where to find them. Grubs, beetles, various larvae, genuinely nutritious, genuinely abundant, genuinely something you're going to have significant psychological resistance to eating, even when you're hungry enough that it's the rational choice. Modern people have strong, culturally conditioned revulsion toward eating insects. Stone Age people did not have this cultural conditioning. They ate insects because insects are food, just like anything else. This is an important and underappreciated point about Stone Age nutrition. Stone Age people's ideas about what counted as food were dramatically broader than yours. River mussels and snails were food. The liver and kidney and brain of the animals they hunted were food. Preferred food, actually, because organ meats are nutritionally dense in ways that were intuitively understood even without biochemistry. Bone marrow was precious. Cracking open large bones to get at the marrow inside was a routine part of processing any large kill, and the marrow is extraordinarily calorie dense. Blood was used. Fat was prized above almost everything else, because in a world of caloric uncertainty, Concentrated fat represents stored energy in its most useful form. You will arrive at your first large kill expecting to eat the parts you recognize from a modern supermarket: the steaks, the roasts, the recognizable pieces. Your Stone Age companions will be efficiently dismembering the animal in ways that prioritize the parts you would instinctively set aside. Who gets the brain? Valuable. The eyes? Fine. The tongue? Excellent. The intestines cleaned quickly and cooked. Of course. The feet? Yes. The tendons? The cartilage? Parts with no modern culinary equivalent? All of it because nothing gets wasted and everything counts. Getting adequate fat in the Stone Age was a constant preoccupation. Lean meat, rabbit for instance, can actually cause a condition called rabbit starvation or protein poisoning, where eating exclusively lean protein without sufficient fat causes the liver to become overwhelmed, processing the excess protein, leading to nausea, diarrhea, and eventually dangerous metabolic disruption. Stone Age people understood this intuitively. They knew that a rabbit was less valuable than it appeared because it couldn't provide the fat their bodies needed. They sought the fattiest animals, the richest marrow, the most calorie-dense plants. Getting this balance wrong had physical consequences that you'd start feeling within days. Now let's talk about cooking, because even when you have food, preparing it safely is not automatic. Fire is your primary cooking technology, and we've already established that maintaining fire in the Stone Age requires skill. But cooking on and around fire without modern cookware introduces its own complications. Roasting meat directly on coals is straightforward and effective, but it doesn't kill all pathogens if the meat isn't cooked thoroughly. And thoroughly is harder to judge when you're cooking a whole leg over an open fire versus a steak in a pan with a thermometer. Undercooked meat from wild animals is a genuine pathogen risk. Wild animals carry a range of parasites and bacteria that domestic animals, who are bred and managed and often medicated specifically to reduce these risks, don't. Trichinella, Toxoplasma, various Salmonella and E. coli strains. All of these are potential passengers in your Stone Age meal. Cook it properly and they die. Eat it undercooked because you're hungry and the smell is incredible, and surely it's fine. And you spend the next several days deeply wretchedly ill at a time, when illness means an inability to contribute to the group's food gathering, which means less food for everyone, including you. The other issue with cooking in the Stone Age is that cooking takes time and fuel, both of which are limited resources. You can't just turn a knob and set the temperature. Managing a fire for cooking, keeping it hot enough to cook effectively but not so hot that it burns everything, is a skill. Knowing how long different foods need, how to arrange them near the fire for even cooking. All of this is learned knowledge. And then there's preservation. When you do have abundant food after a successful large hunt, preserving it matters enormously. Drying, smoking, freezing in cold weather. Stone Age people had all of these techniques and used them routinely, but doing them correctly matters. Improperly smoked or dried meat can develop botulism, which is one of the most toxic naturally occurring substances on Earth. A very small amount of botulinum toxin can cause a form of paralysis that was, in the Stone Age, essentially always fatal. You would not know your preserved food had gone wrong until you ate it, and then you would know very quickly and very decisively. The nutritional precariousness of Stone Age life had effects that went beyond hunger. Seasonal vitamin deficiencies were likely. In northern climates, vitamin D deficiency, caused by limited sun exposure in winter and a diet that, without dairy or fortified foods, provided limited dietary vitamin D, would have caused fatigue, bone pain, and immune suppression. Scurvy, vitamin C deficiency, was a potential risk during long winters when fresh plant food was unavailable, though eating organ meats, which contain some vitamin C, and other animal products helped. Iron deficiency, when large game was scarce, would have caused anemia, fatigue, weakness, reduced cognitive function. You, arriving in this world from a lifetime of nutritionally diverse modern eating, would start experiencing these deficiencies faster than your companions who had adapted to the seasonal rhythms of Stone Age nutrition. Your body expects certain inputs and has been getting them reliably for your entire life. Remove those inputs suddenly, and the effects show up within weeks. The food situation, in summary, is this. Getting enough to eat required a lifetime of specialized knowledge you don't have, skills you haven't developed, physical conditioning you haven't built, and social coordination you're not part of. You'd be dependent on the generosity of your band, who are already working hard to feed themselves, while contributing relatively little to the collective effort. This is a social position with real costs, in a social environment that we need to discuss in some detail. Chapter 4. The Social World. Where your survival actually lives. You are sitting around the evening fire. The light is golden and warm, and for a moment, just a moment, it could almost seem peaceful. People are talking, children are moving around the edges of the group, someone is working on a piece of hide or sharpening a stone tool. There is laughter at something you don't understand. There is an argument about something you don't understand. And there is a conversation happening about you. You can tell by the looks, the tone, the glances, that you absolutely do not understand. Because here is something that survival videos and adventure fantasies consistently get wrong about the Stone Age. Individual survival was largely a myth. The basic survival unit of Paleolithic life was not the individual, it was the band. Your band of approximately 20 to 30 people, the typical size for Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherer groups, constrained by the carrying capacity of the local landscape and the social cohesion limits of human psychology, was your entire world. It was your food supply, your protection, your medical system, your knowledge base, your emotional support, and your only real defense against everything we've discussed so far. Without the band, your personal survival odds in the Stone Age drop from very difficult to essentially zero. Modern people tend to think of social relationships as nice-to-haves, as enrichments to a life that could technically function without them. In the Stone Age, social relationships were load-bearing structures. They were survival infrastructure. Consider what you actually need from other people to survive in the Paleolithic. You need their hunting knowledge and coordination. You need their fire-making skills when yours fail. You need their knowledge of the landscape and its plants and animals. You need their help when you're sick or injured, and you will be sick or injured because the Stone Age is a world of constant physical demand and zero medical infrastructure. You need them to carry you when you can't walk. You need them to feed you when you can't hunt. You need the women who know how to process hides to make your winter clothing. You need the men and women who know how to knap flint to make the tools and weapons you need. You need the collective memory of the group to know where the best hunting is in November, where the hazel grove is that nobody found last year, where the dangerous ford is that looks safe but isn't. All of this is social. All of it requires trust, reciprocity, and standing within the group. And here's where your situation gets delicate. You are a newcomer. You are probably from somewhere else. You don't speak the language well. You don't know the customs. You don't yet have a role or a function that earns you food and protection. You are, from the band's perspective, a cost, someone who eats but doesn't yet contribute proportionally. Stone Age bands were not cruel to outsiders by principle. The archaeological and anthropological evidence suggests that Paleolithic groups were capable of significant generosity. Injured individuals who couldn't contribute fully were often cared for, suggesting a meaningful ethic of mutual support. There are skeletal remains from the Paleolithic showing injuries that would have left their owners dependent on others for extended periods, and those people survived, which means they were fed and protected by their band. But there were limits to that generosity, and those limits were set by the very real constraints of caloric availability. In lean times, a band had to make choices about how resources were distributed. A member who contributed nothing was a different calculation from a member who was temporarily incapacitated but normally productive. And you permanently, structurally, unable to contribute effectively because you simply don't have the knowledge and skills, are a different calculation again. Your social survival in the Stone Age depends on building relationships, demonstrating value in whatever way you can manage, and fitting yourself into the complex web of reciprocity and obligation that structured band life. And you have to do all of this without speaking the language properly, without sharing the cultural context, and while being a consistent drain on resources. What could you contribute? This is a genuinely interesting question. Your modern knowledge might have some limited value in specific contexts. If you happen to be a physician, your understanding of wound cleaning and basic surgical technique might save lives, though without antibiotics or sterile equipment, your medicine is still severely limited. If you happen to be an engineer with knowledge of structural principles, you might contribute to building better shelters. If you knew something about fire management or food preservation from a scientific standpoint, you might improve existing practice. But most of the things you know from modern life are simply irrelevant in the Stone Age. And the things you don't know, the things that matter every single day, leave you dependent on others. The language barrier alone would be profoundly isolating. Human beings communicate not just information, but emotion, intention, reassurance, and solidarity through language. Being unable to participate fully in the social life of your band, unable to tell stories around the fire, unable to understand jokes and arguments, unable to express your fear and exhaustion and needs clearly, would be deeply psychologically damaging in a way that layered on top of everything else. Stone Age social life was rich and complex. These were fully modern human beings with the same emotional needs, the same capacity for joy and humor and love and grief, the same need for connection and recognition. The idea that Paleolithic people were simple or primitive in their social and emotional lives is one of the most thoroughly debunked misconceptions in modern archaeology. They made art, extraordinary art, sophisticated and symbolic. They buried their dead with ceremony and apparent grief. They maintained long-distance trade networks for valued materials. They had music, ritual, story. They were, in every meaningful sense, us, which means that your social isolation in their world would feel exactly as painful as social isolation feels today. Probably more so, because you'd have no alternative sources of connection, no phone, no internet, no ability to go somewhere else. Just the group and your incomplete struggling membership in it every single day. We should also talk about gender roles, because the division of labor in Paleolithic bands was real and significant, and arriving without understanding it, or worse, resisting it, would create social friction you can't afford. Archaeological and anthropological evidence suggests that Paleolithic gender roles were less rigidly constrained than in later agricultural societies. There's evidence of women participating in hunts, and men certainly participated in gathering. But the broad pattern of men taking primary responsibility for large game hunting and women taking primary responsibility for gathering, food processing, and childcare appears to have been widespread. These weren't arbitrary restrictions. They reflected the physical realities of pregnancy and nursing, which made high-risk, high-mobility hunting impractical for women in certain life stages, and they reflected the accumulated specialization that comes from groups dividing cognitive labor. Coming in as a modern person with modern ideas about gender equity, you might resist these roles. This resistance would be inadvisable. Not because the roles were just, but because pushing against the social structure of a band you're dependent on for your survival is not a winning strategy when you don't yet have the standing or the alternative skills to make a case for doing things differently. You are a guest at the most consequential dinner party of your life, and arguing about the seating arrangement is not a useful move. The social world of the Stone Age was also a world where reputation was everything, and where there was nowhere to rebuild a damaged one. In a band of 20 to 30 people with no ability to move on to somewhere new where nobody knew you, your standing in the group was permanent and cumulative. Every interaction, every contribution, every failure, every moment of courage or cowardice, every way you handled a difficult situation, all of it was observed, remembered, and contributed to your standing. This created an environment where social skills were quite literally survival skills. The person who was generous, reliable, useful, and pleasant to be around survived better than the person who was selfish, unreliable, or difficult. Not because of any abstract moral calculus, but because the band's willingness to share with you, protect you, and help you when you needed it was directly affected by what kind of member you were. You are, let's be honest, going to be a difficult member for a while. Not through any fault of your character, but through the simple reality of arriving without the skills and knowledge that define useful membership. Getting through that period, demonstrating enough value in the ways you can, building relationships despite the language barrier, learning as fast as possible, is itself a survival challenge, and it's one that will define your medium-term prospects in this world, far more than your ability to start a fire. The evening fire is burning low. Your band is settling for the night. So, some people already asleep, others still talking quietly. Someone hands you a piece of dried meat, and it's not much, but it's something, and the gesture carries more warmth than you can fully process right now. You take it gratefully. It has been, by any reasonable measure, the hardest day of your life. And tomorrow will be harder, because tomorrow the cold will be the same, and the hunger will be worse, and your body will be stiffer and more exhausted. And every day after that will be another calculation in a survival equation that gets no easier with time. But you're still here. You made it through day one. We're just getting started. Why you wouldn't survive a day in the Stone Age. Part 2. Chapter 5. Your body is not ready. The physical reality. You wake up on your second morning in the Stone Age, and your body has opinions. Loud, urgent, impossible to ignore opinions. Every muscle you used yesterday, which was every muscle you have, is announcing its displeasure in a detailed and comprehensive fashion. Your hands are blistered from the firewood you gathered. Your feet are sore in ways that make you realize you have never, in your entire life, actually used your feet properly. Your back is a symphony of complaints from sleeping on the ground, and somewhere deep in your legs, in muscle groups you weren't entirely aware existed, there is a burning ache that tells you that the amount of walking you did yesterday, which felt like a lot, was actually just an ordinary day for the people around you. This is the physical reality of Stone Age life, and it is where the gap between modern humans and our Paleolithic ancestors becomes most embarrassingly obvious. Let's start with something fundamental. Paleolithic people were, in terms of raw physical capability, significantly more robust than most modern humans. Not because they were a different species, they were anatomically modern Homo sapiens, identical to us in every biological respect, but because their bodies had been shaped from birth by a lifestyle of constant demanding physical activity in ways that modern sedentary or semi-sedentary existence simply doesn't replicate. Analysis of Paleolithic skeletal remains tells a remarkable story. The bones of upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherers show bone density and muscle attachment markers that indicate habitual physical activity at levels that would be extraordinary by modern standards. The arm bones of Paleolithic women, for instance, show asymmetric development, suggesting they routinely performed the kind of sustained, forceful work, processing hides, grinding plant material, carrying heavy loads, that would be considered elite athletic performance today. Men's bones tell a similar story of extraordinary lifetime physical conditioning. Paleoanthropologist Timothy Shaw has noted that the average upper Paleolithic human appears to have been stronger, faster, and more physically capable than most modern people, including modern athletes, simply because they engaged in genuinely demanding physical activity every single day, from early childhood through the end of their lives. There was no off-season. There were no rest days unless injury or illness forced them. Physical capability was survival capability, and survival was relentless. You, by contrast, have a body that has been optimized, if optimized is even the right word, for modern life. You can sit for hours without physical difficulty. You can perform precise, repetitive tasks with your hands. You probably have reasonable cardiovascular fitness if you exercise regularly. But the specific demands of Stone Age physical existence carrying heavy loads over rough terrain for miles, performing sustained, forceful work with hand tools for hours, moving quickly and safely through complex natural environments, managing the physical demands of cold and hunger, and constant exertion. These are not things your body is currently equipped for. The transition would be brutal and long. Let's talk about walking first, because in the Stone Age, you walk a lot. Estimates for the daily distance covered by hunter-gatherer groups vary considerably by season and food availability, but figures of 10 to 20 kilometers per day during active foraging and hunting periods are well supported by comparison with modern hunter-gatherer groups. That's 6 to 12 miles every day on terrain that is not a smooth pavement or a well-maintained trail. It is ground that is uneven, root-crossed, sometimes steep, sometimes wet, sometimes covered in snow, and always requiring your full attention to navigate safely. And you're doing this in footwear that, even by Stone Age standards, is primitive compared to modern hiking boots. The earliest confirmed footwear from this period, where it survives, which is rare, suggests simple hide wrappings or basic sandal-like constructions, good enough for feet that have been conditioned since childhood to handle rough terrain. Not, perhaps, ideal for feet that have spent their lives in cushioned modern shoes and are encountering this level of demand for the first time. Blisters. We need to talk about blisters. You are going to get blisters. And in the Stone Age, blisters are not a minor inconvenience. They are open wounds. And open wounds in an environment with no sterile bandages, no antiseptic, no antibiotics, and no medical care beyond what traditional knowledge and available plant materials can provide, are infection risks. Foot infections, left untreated, can progress from localized discomfort to systemic infection in ways that, in the modern world, are managed easily with antibiotics, and in the Stone Age were potentially fatal. This is actually a good moment to discuss the broader issue of minor injuries, because in the Stone Age, there was no such thing as a truly minor injury. There were injuries that healed without complications, and injuries that got infected and killed you, and the line between them was not always predictable. Cut your hand processing an animal carcass. That's a wound in an environment where your hands are in constant contact with animal blood, gut contents, soil, feces, and whatever else the Paleolithic world has deposited on every surface. Bacteria will find that wound. Whether they colonize it and cause a serious infection depends on factors you can't fully control. The specific bacteria present, the depth and nature of the wound, your immune system's current state, whether your band has effective wound treatment knowledge. Stone Age people were not helpless in the face of injury. Far from it. Archaeological evidence shows remarkable surgical interventions, including trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, that patients survived, and the use of various plant-based treatments for wounds and illness. Honey has genuine antibacterial properties and was almost certainly used for wound treatment in some form. Various plant compounds, tannins, some essential oils, specific resins have antimicrobial effects. The traditional medical knowledge of hunter-gatherer societies is not primitive in any meaningful sense. It's sophisticated, carefully accumulated over generations, and often genuinely effective within its limitations. But genuinely effective within its limitations is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The limitations are real. Septicemia, blood poisoning from bacterial infection, was one of the leading causes of death in the ancient world. It still kills people today, even with modern antibiotics, if treatment is delayed or ineffective. In the Stone Age, a deep wound that became infected had a meaningful probability of becoming systemic sepsis. And systemic sepsis without antibiotics has a mortality rate somewhere north of 80%. Your immune system is, in fairness, not nothing. Humans have evolved robust immune responses over millions of years, and your body is actually quite good at fighting off many of the pathogens it encounters. But your immune system is calibrated to the pathogen environment you grew up in, which is not the same as the pathogen environment of the Stone Age. Different regions, different eras, different dominant strains, your immune system will encounter challenges it has no prior experience with, and some of those challenges will be more than it can handle. Now let's talk about your hands specifically, because your hands are your most critical tools in the Stone Age, and the state of your hands tells you a great deal about the gap between your physical preparation and what the environment demands. Stone Age tool making, knapping flint to create sharp edges for cutting, scraping, and piercing, is one of the most skillful physical crafts in human history. The best Paleolithic knappers produced blade tools of extraordinary precision and quality, working by pressure and percussion to remove flakes of stone in controlled, intentional ways to create specific shapes with specific properties. The finished products, knives, scrapers, burins, projectile points, were genuinely excellent tools, well designed for their purposes and surprisingly sharp. Making them, however, requires years of practice and very specific physical skills. Your first attempts at flint knapping will be dangerous and unproductive in roughly equal measure. Flint is sharp. The flakes that come off when you're knapping are razor-edged in all directions, including the directions you didn't intend to create edges in. Novice knappers cut themselves. They also produce tools that are inferior in function, thicker than they should be, the wrong shape, poorly balanced, and inferior tools mean inferior hunting performance, inferior hide processing, inferior woodworking, inferior everything. Your band will carry you through this learning period to the extent that they can. They have their own tools and they can share them. But there's a reason that expert knappers were valued members of Stone Age communities. The ability to produce good tools reliably was a genuine specialization that took years to develop and made a real difference to the band's overall effectiveness. Being unable to do it doesn't just inconvenience you, it's another way you're dependent on others for something fundamental. The physical work of food processing is another area where the gap between your capabilities and what's needed becomes very apparent. Processing a large animal kill, removing the hide, separating meat from bone, accessing the marrow, managing the organs is physically demanding, skilled work that experienced hunters and butchers can do quickly and efficiently. Done poorly, it wastes meat, damages useful materials, hides, bones, sinew, and takes far longer than it should. Every extra hour spent on butchering is an hour not spent on other necessary tasks, and in a world where daylight hours are precious, time wasted has real costs. Hide processing is even more labor-intensive. Turning a fresh animal hide into something wearable involves a lengthy sequence of steps, scraping fat and membrane from the inner surface, treating it to prevent stiffening and decay, working it repeatedly to soften the leather, potentially smoking it for water resistance. Done properly, the result is warm, flexible, effective clothing. Done improperly, the hide stiffens when it gets wet and dries into something approaching leather armor, which is warm and structural but deeply uncomfortable to wear and not particularly good insulation. Your clothing in the Stone Age is not a fashion choice. It is survival equipment, and its quality directly affects your ability to stay warm and mobile. Inferior clothing means greater cold exposure, which means greater energy expenditure to maintain core temperature, which means greater caloric need at a time when calories are already limited, which means faster physical deterioration. Let's talk about your feet again, because there's something important we didn't quite finish. Stone Age people had significantly different foot biomechanics than most modern humans. The combination of going barefoot or in minimal footwear from childhood, walking on varied natural terrain constantly, and the specific gait adaptations that come with those conditions resulted in feet that were stronger, more flexible, and better adapted to the demands of Paleolithic locomotion than the feet of people who have spent their lives in modern supportive footwear. The arches of your feet, both the medial longitudinal arch and the transverse arch, have been significantly shaped by a lifetime of cushioned support. Stone Age walking demands much more from those structures than you are used to providing. The specific muscles that stabilize the foot and ankle in varied terrain, the strength of the intrinsic foot muscles, the proprioceptive, sensitivity that allows safe movement on uneven ground. In poor light, all of these are underdeveloped in most modern people and would take months to years of conditioning to bring to Paleolithic useful levels. In the meantime, your ankles are at elevated risk. Rolling an ankle on rough terrain is an extremely common injury even for conditioned modern hikers, and Stone Age terrain was not a maintained hiking trail. A serious ankle sprain, ligament damage that prevents weight bearing, in the Stone Age is a genuine crisis. You cannot contribute to food gathering. You cannot retreat quickly from danger. You are dependent on others for your most basic mobility. And it will take weeks to heal, during which your position in the band becomes increasingly precarious. Knee injuries from sustained overuse on rough terrain, back injuries from carrying heavy loads in ways your body isn't conditioned for, shoulder injuries from repetitive overhead work. All of these are on the menu, and all of them have the same structure. An injury that in the modern world is a medical appointment, and some physical therapy becomes, in the Stone Age, a crisis with no certain resolution. The cumulative physical demand of Stone Age life was not manageable by incremental adjustment. It required a body built from childhood for exactly these demands. You are attempting to retrofit an adult body that has spent its entire developmental period under completely different conditions, and the retrofitting process is going to be painful, slow, and incomplete. By the end of your first week in the Stone Age, if you survived your first week, which is genuinely uncertain, your body would be a catalog of developing problems, blisters becoming calluses slowly, muscles adapting reluctantly, new skills being acquired at the cost of mistakes that cut and bruise and strain. Your physical condition during that transition period would be significantly worse than either a Stone Age native or a fully adapted version of yourself. You'd be in the worst possible place, demanding too much of a body that isn't ready, in an environment that offers no forgiveness. Chapter 6: Medicine, Injury, and Illness. The world without a safety net. You have been in the Stone Age for 2 weeks. The blisters have started to harden. You've learned a handful of words and phrases. You know where the water source is, and which time of morning is relatively safer to go there. You've participated in 3 foraging expeditions and 1 unsuccessful hunt. You are, by the most generous possible assessment, starting to figure out the very outermost edges of this world. And then you wake up with a fever. Not a dramatic, obviously dangerous fever. Just the kind of fever that in the modern world would prompt you to take some ibuprofen, drink extra water, maybe call in sick to work, and feel reasonably confident you'd be fine in a day or 2. A 38.5 degree fever, some body aches, a headache that makes it hard to think clearly. In the modern world, this is an inconvenience. In the Stone Age, this is a crisis. Let's talk about what illness actually means when you have no pharmaceutical medicine, no ability to identify what's causing the fever, no way to prevent complications, and a social situation where being sick means not contributing, which means being a cost to the people whose protection and food sharing you depend on. First, the diagnostic problem. Your fever could be caused by approximately 40 different things, most of which your band's most knowledgeable healer, and there will be a healer because every human society has developed specialist knowledge about treating illness and injury, cannot distinguish between. Is it a viral infection that will run its course in a few days? Is it the early stages of a bacterial infection that, untreated, will become sepsis? Is it a parasitic infection from contaminated water 2 weeks ago that's now entering a dangerous phase? Is it the beginning of one of the epidemic diseases that periodically swept through Stone Age populations? The symptoms at this stage look similar for all of these. The treatment for a viral infection is rest, hydration, and time. The treatment for bacterial sepsis in the modern world is intravenous antibiotics, intensive monitoring, and possibly surgical intervention. In the Stone Age, the treatment for bacterial sepsis is whatever plant-based medicines the healer has available, spiritual intervention, and hope. The survival rate for bacterial sepsis with modern treatment is around 80% with prompt attention. Without antibiotics, it's closer to 20%. You don't know which one you have. Your healer doesn't know which one you have. You rest by the fire, drink water, accept whatever the healer gives you. Certain plant preparations are genuinely useful. Others have placebo value at best, and wait to see which trajectory you're on. This waiting, this profound uncertainty about whether a fever means you'll be fine in 3 days, or this is how it ends, was a constant feature of Stone Age existence. Every significant illness was a roll of the dice, with stakes too high to be comfortable thinking about. The psychological cost of this uncertainty alone was significant, not just for the sick person, but for everyone in the band who cared about them and could do nothing but watch and hope. Let's talk about the specific diseases that were present in the Upper Paleolithic, because the disease landscape was different from both modern times and the later historical periods we often imagine when we think of ancient illness. The great pandemic diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, plague, were largely absent from the Paleolithic. These diseases require large, dense, sedentary human populations to sustain themselves, and hunter-gatherer bands are neither large enough nor sedentary enough to maintain the transmission chains these diseases need. In this sense, Paleolithic people were better protected from epidemic disease than the populations of early cities would be thousands of years later. What they did have were parasitic infections, fungal infections, bacterial wound infections, respiratory infections, and the various pathogens that accompany close living with animals and contaminated water. Tuberculosis appears to have been present in some form for much longer than previously thought. Intestinal worms were essentially universal. Various skin conditions caused by fungi and mites were common. Respiratory infections, bronchitis, pneumonia, killed people regularly, particularly the elderly, the young, and anyone whose immune system was already compromised by malnutrition or other illness. Dental problems were a significant cause of suffering. Paleolithic diets were actually reasonably good for teeth, lower in refined sugars, higher in dental abrasive fibrous foods than later agricultural diets. But dental infections did occur, and an infected tooth in the Stone Age was an experience of sustained, serious pain with limited options for treatment. No dentist, no antibiotics for the resulting abscess, pain management through available plant-based analgesics that were effective enough to be survivable, but not enough to eliminate the suffering. Tooth extraction, when a tooth became untenable, was apparently practiced in the Stone Age. There's archaeological evidence of deliberate tooth removal. The technique would have been brutal, the risk of infection during the procedure high, and the pain management primitive at best. Surviving a significant dental problem in the Stone Age required genuine toughness and a measure of luck. Broken bones are another instructive case. Fractures do appear in Paleolithic skeletal remains, and some of them show evidence of healing, evidence that the person survived and the bone knitted back together. But bone healing in the Stone Age happened without X-rays to verify alignment, without surgical implants to stabilize complex fractures, without the kind of immobilization and physical therapy that ensures optimal healing. A simple fracture of a bone, like the radius or ulna, the forearm bones, might heal adequately with splinting and rest. A complex fracture or a fracture of a weight-bearing bone, like the femur, was a potentially life-ending injury. Femur fractures are extraordinarily painful, and without traction or surgical stabilization, the risk of the bone healing misaligned, or of the person dying from blood loss and shock in the days immediately following the fracture, was high. The archaeological record shows us both sides of this. There are Paleolithic skeletons with healed injuries that required care and time to recover from, suggesting that bands invested in injured members. And there are skeletons with injuries that clearly ended the person's life relatively quickly, suggesting the limits of what was possible. Childbirth is another area where the absence of modern medicine made an enormous difference. Maternal mortality from childbirth is, with good obstetric care, extremely low in the modern world. In the Stone Age, it was significantly higher, not because Stone Age women were physically unsuited to childbirth, and not because traditional birth-attending knowledge was negligible, but because obstetric emergencies, placenta previa, cord prolapse, obstructed labor, cannot always be resolved without surgical intervention. A cesarean section in the Stone Age, if attempted, would almost certainly kill the mother. Without it, a labor that can't progress naturally becomes a death sentence for both mother and child. The women who attended births in Stone Age bands had genuine knowledge and skill. They managed normal births effectively, knew how to assist with positioning, knew when a birth was progressing normally and when it wasn't. But the line between "this will be fine" and "this requires an operating room" runs through emergencies that no amount of traditional knowledge can resolve without the technology that didn't yet exist. Infant and child mortality in the Paleolithic was high, not because Stone Age parents didn't care for their children, but because the environmental challenges, cold disease, accident, food insecurity, that modern medicine and infrastructure have made manageable were fully unmanaged. A child who develops a serious infection, who is injured in an accident, who encounters a pathogen their undeveloped immune system can't handle. That child in the Stone Age had outcomes that were worse than they would be today. Your own experience of illness in the Stone Age would be shaped by another factor that's easy to underestimate: the psychological experience of being sick in a world with no certain treatment. Modern people who are seriously ill can generally trust that professional help is available, that there are treatments with known efficacy, that the trajectory of their illness is understood and being managed. This trust provides a kind of psychological scaffolding that makes illness easier to bear. In the Stone Age, you get sick, and you don't know why, and you don't know what will help, and you don't know whether you're going to get better or whether this is the beginning of the end. The healer does their best with genuine knowledge and real skill, but both of you know that there are outcomes beyond their control. That uncertainty is its own kind of suffering, layered on top of the physical. The mental health dimension of Stone Age life is worth addressing directly because it's rarely discussed in survival contexts, but was deeply real. Chronic stress, grief, trauma, and the psychological consequences of constant physical hardship affected Stone Age people, just as they affect people today. The human nervous system's response to sustained threat, the chronic activation of stress, hormones, the hypervigilance, the difficulty sleeping, was a feature of Paleolithic existence, not an occasional deviation from it. We have evidence from modern hunter-gatherer societies, groups that, while not identical to Paleolithic cultures, share enough structural similarities to be informative, that depression, anxiety, and what we might now call post-traumatic responses occurred. The loss of a child, the death of a close companion in a hunt, the experience of famine, these things caused genuine psychological suffering that the social and spiritual resources of the band worked to address with varying success. You would bring your own psychological vulnerabilities into this world, your modern anxieties and learned responses, none of which are tuned to the specific stressors of the Paleolithic. And you would encounter stressors for which you have no preparation whatsoever. The first time you watch someone in your band die from something preventable, an infection that antibiotics would have cleared, a birth gone wrong, a predator attack on a companion, and know that you can do nothing, that there is nothing to be done, that this is simply how it is. That knowledge is a weight that doesn't lift. Chapter 7. The elements, weather, seasons, and the long winter. You are several months into your Stone Age existence, and autumn has arrived. You can feel it in the mornings. The temperature has dropped noticeably. The days are shorter. The leaves on the trees are changing. In the modern world, autumn means pumpkin-spiced everything, and the slightly guilty pleasure of getting out your heaviest sweater. In the Upper Paleolithic of Europe, during a glacial or near-glacial period, autumn means one thing above all others. The countdown to winter has started, and you have a very finite amount of time to prepare. The seasonality of Stone Age life was not the gentle background rhythm that modern people experience. It was a governing structure around which everything else was organized, And getting it wrong, being underprepared when winter arrived, was potentially fatal. Let's establish what winter in the Upper Paleolithic of Europe actually looked like. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, much of northern Europe was under ice sheets, and the areas that weren't were substantially colder than modern equivalents. Even in the warmer periods of the Upper Paleolithic, European winters were more severe than most people today would find comfortable, with temperatures in many regions regularly dropping below -10 or -15 degrees Celsius, sometimes significantly lower. The human body can survive these temperatures, but only with adequate shelter, adequate clothing, adequate food, and adequate fire. Remove any one of these, and the math changes very quickly. Shelter preparation for winter was a major undertaking. If your band was using a cave, they would work to improve its insulation and wine resistance before winter set in, blocking drafts with hides, building internal structures to concentrate warmth around sleeping areas, ensuring the fire situation was manageable. If you were using constructed shelters, which Paleolithic people absolutely did, sometimes quite sophisticated ones, winter meant reinforcing them, checking the structures for stability, potentially building larger communal sleeping areas to cool body heat. The construction of adequate Stone Age shelter is another of those skills that looks simpler than it is. The mammoth bone dwellings found at sites like Mezherik in Ukraine, structures built using the bones of dozens of mammoths as a framework, covered with hides, were genuinely sophisticated architectural solutions to the problem of building in treeless steppes with limited wood. They weren't random piles of bones. They were engineered structures with specific design logic, built by people who understood the structural properties of the materials and the wind patterns of the local landscape. You know how to do none of this. You can help with the physical labor of construction, carrying materials, holding things in place. But the design decisions, the knowledge of which configurations work and which collapse, the understanding of how to position a shelter relative to prevailing winds while maintaining good fire ventilation, all of this belongs to the experienced builders in your group. Fuel, winter fuel. This may be the single most important logistical problem of Paleolithic winter, and it's one that requires constant, sustained effort starting in autumn and continuing throughout the cold months. Fire needs fuel. Keeping a fire burning through the night in winter requires a substantial amount of dry wood. Collecting that wood, processing it into usable fuel, storing it in ways that keep it dry, managing the fire's consumption against the supply. These are ongoing, labor-intensive tasks that fall to everyone in the band. Wood, where available, was the primary fuel. But in open steppe environments, which were the dominant landscape in much of Ice Age Europe, trees were scarce. Paleolithic people in these environments used alternatives, animal bones and fat, which burn with a hot, sustained flame, and a notable smell, and dung, which when dried, burns slowly and can maintain a fire effectively. Managing these alternative fuels requires knowledge of their different properties, how to stack bone fuel for maximum heat, how to use animal fat as accelerant while controlling the heat to avoid burning too hot too fast, how to prepare and dry dung for burning. Your instinct, coming from a wood-burning culture, would be to look for wood, which is the right instinct if wood is available, and the wrong one if it isn't. Now let's talk about what winter does to your food supply. Large game becomes harder to find. Many species migrate or reduce their range, and deep snow makes tracking more difficult and movement more exhausting. Plant foods essentially disappear. The berries, roots, tubers, and fungi that supplemented the summer diet are gone or frozen. What you eat in winter is primarily what you killed and preserved before winter, supplemented by whatever hunting can provide in difficult conditions. The preserved food problem has two parts. You need to have preserved enough, and it needs to have remained safe to eat. Preserving food by drying and smoking requires extended periods of good weather and careful technique. A wet, cold autumn, which is entirely plausible and historically common, gives you less time and worse conditions for preservation, meaning your winter food stores are lower than they should be. A period of unusually warm weather in early winter can begin to spoil stored food before temperatures drop enough to freeze and preserve it. The margin between having enough and not having enough was often uncomfortably thin. Water access becomes complicated in winter when water sources freeze. Breaking ice to reach unfrozen water is possible, but requires effort and creates risk. Ice is unstable, edges can break, and falling into frozen water is extremely dangerous. Melting snow for water is an option, but requires fire and fuel, both of which are limited. And snowmelt, like surface water, can be contaminated. Animal populations continue to defecate in and near water sources year-round, and contamination doesn't freeze away. The darkness of winter had psychological effects that we shouldn't underestimate. In northern latitudes, at glacial period latitudes, winter means very long nights and very short days. This affects sleep patterns, mood, and energy in ways that are well documented even in modern populations. Seasonal affective disorder is a real phenomenon. Without electric lighting, the darkness of a Paleolithic winter night was genuine darkness, broken only by fire. The long nights were dangerous. They were when predators were most active and when the cold was most intense. And they were disorienting in ways that reinforced the general sense of vulnerability. Winter was also when accumulated injuries and illnesses from the rest of the year made themselves felt most forcefully. The person with a persistent cough from autumn was more vulnerable to winter cold. The person with a healing ankle injury was more limited in their ability to contribute to winter hunting. The older members of the band, whose physical capabilities had begun to decline, faced particular challenges in winter. Cold is hardest on the elderly, food is scarcest in winter, and the physical demands of winter survival favor the young and strong. Your band's winter survival plan was not just a physical plan, it was a social plan. Who got what food? How were limited resources distributed? How were the most vulnerable members protected? These social negotiations happened within the framework of relationships, built over years, governed by customs and obligations that your band understood deeply, and you were still learning. And then eventually, spring came. And spring in the Stone Age was not primarily a time of relief and renewal, though it was that too. It was a time of maximum vulnerability. This seems counterintuitive. Winter is the cold, dark, dangerous season. Why would spring be harder? The answer is what historians and archaeologists sometimes call the hungry gap, or the hungry months, the period in late winter and early spring when stored food from the previous year is running low or exhausted. The game you can hunt is lean and scarce after a winter of limited foraging, and the new season's plant growth hasn't yet provided edible food. The berries won't ripen for months. The roots are just starting to re-establish themselves after winter dormancy. The animals are thin. Analysis of historical and archaeological data consistently shows elevated mortality rates in late winter and early spring across pre-agricultural and early agricultural societies. The bodies of people who survived winter in a weakened state, on reduced rations, were less able to resist infection and less resilient to accident. The immune-compromised, the young, the elderly. This was when they were most at risk. You would arrive in autumn, go through your first Stone Age winter on the shallow knowledge base you'd built over a few months, and then face the spring hungry gap at a point when your physical reserves were at their lowest. The seasonal structure of Stone Age existence was fundamentally unforgiving, and it was most unforgiving precisely when your body was least equipped to handle it. Spring, however, also meant the eventual return of abundance, the explosive return of plant life, the arrival of migrating birds and animals, the warming of the world, and the opening of possibilities. The feast and famine cycle was real on a seasonal scale, not just a daily one. What got you through winter got you to spring, and what got you through spring's hungry gap got you to the extraordinary abundance of summer. But getting there required surviving each step. The cold, the scarcity, the illness risk, the accumulated physical toll. All of it had to be managed without the tools that make modern winter survivable as a matter of course. Chapter 8. What you know and don't know. The knowledge gap is the real killer. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine taking the most experienced, most physically capable outdoor survivalist alive today. Someone who has spent decades in wilderness environments, who knows plant identification, tracking, fire making, primitive construction, every relevant skill, and dropping them cold into a specific region of Upper Paleolithic Europe that they've never visited before. They would struggle, not terminally. Their skills would give them a genuine foundation, but they would struggle because the most important survival knowledge is always local and specific. Which plants are edible in this exact region? Where do the game animals go in late autumn? Which water sources are contaminated by upstream activity? Where is the safe ford across the river when it floods in spring? These questions don't have universal answers. They have local answers, built up over years or generations of experience with a specific place. Now take you with your gym membership, your reasonable general knowledge, your smartphone you can't use, and drop you in the same place. The gap between you and the expert survivalist is significant. The gap between either of you and a person who has lived in that landscape their entire life, whose parents lived there, whose grandparents' knowledge is embedded in the cultural memory of their band. That gap is enormous. This is the knowledge gap that would actually kill you in the Stone Age, more than any individual skill deficiency. It's not that you can't learn to make fire, you can. It would take weeks or months, but you'd get there. It's not that you can't eventually learn to track or identify local plants. With enough time and a patient teacher, those skills are learnable. The problem is that you don't have years. You have right now. You have today and tomorrow, and whatever days after that your survival situation allows. And in that immediate time frame, the gap between what you know and what you need to know to function is a chasm that your good intentions and modern intelligence cannot bridge quickly enough. Consider the knowledge that an experienced Stone Age person carried as baseline intuition, things they didn't even think of as knowledge because they were so deeply embedded. The way a certain animal's tracks change when it's moving toward water versus away from it, the specific smell of the air before a serious storm in this region, which direction the prevailing wind comes from in which season, the sound that means a cave bear has been using this shelter recently, the plant that looks almost identical to a good food source but has a slightly different stem texture that you learn to feel before you ever see the flower, the angle of the sun that tells you how many hours of daylight you have left, the behavior of the birds that tells you what's moving in the undergrowth. All of this is information, real, actionable, survival-critical information that is invisible to you. You move through a landscape that is constantly broadcasting its state to anyone who can read it, and you are reading approximately 5% of the signal. Stone Age people were, in cognitive terms, not operating at a lower level than modern humans. They were, in many ways, operating at a higher level of environmental awareness than most modern people ever achieve. The cognitive demands of hunter-gatherer life, tracking, navigation, plant identification, weather prediction, social calculation, tool-making, fire management, multi-day, hunt coordination required and exercised a breadth of practical intelligence that modern specialized existence rarely calls on. The idea that our ancestors were cognitively simple compared to us is not just wrong, it has it backwards. They were using more of their cognitive capacity, more fully, across a wider range of domains than most of us do in daily modern life. What they didn't have was the specific, accumulated, institutionalized knowledge that modern civilization has built up across thousands of years. Germ theory, metallurgy, agricultural science, engineering mathematics. They didn't know things we know, but we don't know things they knew. And in their environment, the things they knew were the ones that mattered. Your modern knowledge is not worthless if your fever turns out to be something that responds to rest, hydration, and the available plant medicines. Your understanding of why hydration matters gives you motivation to drink when you don't feel like it. Your understanding of wound care, even the basic principle of keeping a wound clean, has value even without access to antiseptics. Your general understanding of nutrition helps you make better choices about what to eat when options are limited, but none of this compensates for what you lack. The practical, embodied, locally specific knowledge that Stone Age life required was not something that could be downloaded or reasoned through. It had to be lived over years in a specific place, with people who already knew it. And you are at the beginning of that process, in the most demanding possible environment, with the least possible margin for error. The Stone Age isn't just a different time, it's a different cognitive world. One that ran on a type of knowledge that is largely unavailable to you, built by processes you don't have time to replicate, embedded in a social context you're still learning to navigate. Every day you survive in that world, you're narrowing the gap, slightly. You're learning things that matter. You're building the calluses and the muscle memory, and the landscape familiarity, and the language capability that would eventually make you genuinely functional. But eventually is the word that matters. And eventually assumes you survive the gap. The cold before you figure out the fire. The wrong plant before you've learned the landscape. The predator before you've learned to read the signs. The fever before you've built any immunity reserve. The winter before you've really understood the preparations it requires. The knowledge gap is the real killer in the Stone Age. Not the predators, not the cold, not the food. All of those are dangerous, yes, genuinely dangerous in ways that your modern life has never asked you to confront. But experienced Stone Age people navigated all of those dangers and survived. What they had that you don't is the specific, deep, embodied knowledge of how to navigate them. Acquiring that knowledge is your only real path to genuine Stone Age survival. And the acquisition process is brutally unforgiving. The fire is burning low again. Someone in your band is telling a story. You can hear it in the cadence of their voice, the way the others are leaning in, the laughter at a particular moment, and the silence at another. You don't understand most of it, but you're starting to understand more than you did a week ago. And tomorrow, you'll understand a little more than today. The Stone Age kills slowly for those it doesn't kill quickly. And the slow path, the one that involves learning and adapting, and building the knowledge and skills and relationships that survival requires, is genuinely available to you. In theory, over years, if you survive the gap. But the gap is very, very wide, and most of us, arriving in that world as we are, wouldn't make it across it. Why? You wouldn't survive a day in the Stone Age. Part 3, Chapter 9, Tools and Technology. The difference between alive and not you are holding a piece of flint in your hand. It's about the size of your palm, gray and glassy and heavy in a way that stone has when it hasn't been worked yet. Somewhere inside this rock is a knife, a scraper, the tip of a spear that will determine whether tonight's hunt succeeds or fails. The person sitting across from you, an older woman in your band, one of the most skilled tool makers, makes it look easy. She positions a hammerstone, strikes with precise controlled force, and a long, thin flake separates from the core with a sound like a small, satisfying crack. She does it again and again. Within 20 minutes, she has produced something that will cut meat efficiently and hold an edge better than most modern knives. You try. You hold the flint. You position the hammerstone. You strike. The flake goes sideways. The core cracks wrong. A sharp edge catches your finger in a way that is not serious, but is not comfortable either. The toolmaker watches you without expression. You try again. This is your introduction to the most consequential technology of the Stone Age, and it is going to take you considerably longer to master than 20 minutes. The technology gap between you and your Stone Age companions is not just a matter of what tools exist, it's a matter of understanding, deeply and practically, how to make and use the tools that do exist. And in the Stone Age, your ability to produce and maintain your own tools is the difference between being a functional member of your band and being permanently dependent on others for the most basic instruments of daily survival. Let's be specific about what Stone Age technology actually encompassed, because the word primitive, which gets applied casually to Paleolithic technology, is deeply misleading. Stone Age tools were not primitive solutions to simple problems. They were sophisticated solutions to complex problems, developed and refined over hundreds of thousands of years of cumulative human innovation. The fact that they were made of stone, bone, and wood rather than metal doesn't make them simple. It makes them the product of a completely different technological tradition with its own depth of knowledge and its own demanding skill requirements. Flint knapping, the production of sharp stone tools by controlled fracture, requires understanding the mechanical properties of cryptocrystalline stone, how it fractures, where the force travels through it, how different strikes produce different results, the geometry of tool design, the angles needed for a useful cutting edge, the thickness ratios that determine whether a blade holds its edge or shatters, and the physical execution of strikes that require both precision and appropriate force. Master knappers could produce blades thinner than modern glass, with edges sharper than surgical steel. These weren't accidents. They were the result of years of practice informed by deep, technical understanding. Beyond the knapping itself, understanding which stone to use was critical. Not all flint is equal. Grain size, hydration level, the presence of internal flaws. All of these affect how stone knaps and how useful the resulting tools are. Learning to select good raw material, knowing where quality stone was found in your region, understanding which local sources produced better tools than others. This was specialized knowledge that took years to accumulate. Your band likely had access to high-quality stone, either locally or through trade networks. Upper Paleolithic people maintained exchange networks across significant distances. Toolstone, shells, and other valued materials have been found far from their geological sources, suggesting active, long-distance trade. Understanding these networks, knowing who to approach for what to offer in exchange. This was part of the social technological knowledge that experienced band members carried. Bone and antler technology, using animal materials to produce tools like needles, harpoon points, hooks, and handles, required different but equally sophisticated knowledge. Bone has grain structure and responds differently to different working techniques. Antler, particularly the softer velvet antler from young animals, could be carved into complex shapes. Splitting long bones to access the flat planes of cortical bone for needle production was a specialized process that required the right tools and the right technique. The sewing needles produced by Upper Paleolithic craftspeople, some with eye holes less than a millimeter across, were made using techniques that most modern people couldn't replicate without practice. Those needles matter enormously because clothing, real, functional, winter-proof clothing, required them. Let's talk about clothing production as a technology because it is both more complex and more important than most people realize. We've touched on hide processing before, but the full sequence of turning an animal skin into a wearable, warm, functional garment involves multiple distinct stages of work, each requiring its own tools and techniques. First, the scraping. Fresh hide must have the remaining fat and membrane removed from the inner surface. This is done with a stone scraper, and doing it effectively without cutting through the hide or leaving too much residue requires a specific tool with a specific edge geometry, used with a specific technique. Done poorly, the hide rots faster or doesn't tan properly. Then the processing, either brain tanning, where the animal's brain, which conveniently provides roughly the right amount of tanning compounds for its own hide, is worked into the skin, and then the skin is stretched and worked repeatedly until soft, or other tanning methods using bark, smoke, or other materials. Getting this right is the difference between hide that stays supple and holds together under use and hide that stiffens when wet and cracks when dry. Then the cutting and sewing, patterns that account for the three-dimensional shape of the human body and the need for freedom of movement. Seam construction that is strong enough to hold under physical stress. The layering of materials for insulation in cold weather garments. All of this requiring design knowledge, those tiny needles and sinew thread that also had to be prepared from the tendons of prey animals. The clothing that Paleolithic people produced was genuinely excellent cold weather gear. Archaeological evidence from frozen remains and from the analysis of preserved ancient textiles suggests sophisticated construction, layered garments with tailored fits, waterproofing through smoke treatment, insulation designs that worked with body heat rather than against it. This was functional technology that has been validated by modern outdoor clothing design principles. The people making it knew exactly what they were doing. You do not know how to make these garments. You can perhaps sew simple shapes with some guidance if someone walks you through the needle and sinew process, the pattern making, the hide selection and processing, the specific techniques for maximizing insulation while maintaining mobility. These belong to the craftspeople in your band. Your winter clothing will be given to you or made with your labor directed by their knowledge because you lack the technical capability to produce it yourself. The consequences of inadequate clothing in winter we've already discussed, but it's worth emphasizing that dependence on others for your basic protective equipment is a vulnerable position. If something disrupts your band, illness sweeping through, conflict that splits the group, a need to travel faster than you're equipped for, your inability to produce your own gear becomes a potential crisis. Let me talk about one technology that might seem minor, but has enormous practical importance: cordage. The ability to make rope, string, and cordage from plant and animal fibers is foundational to an astonishing number of other technologies. You need cordage to bind tool hafts, attaching stone points to wooden shafts for spears and arrows. You need it for bow construction, for snare setting, for constructing shelter frames, for carrying loads, for dozens of daily applications. Making usable cordage from plant fibers by twisting and plying fibers in specific ways that lock them together under tension is another of those skills that looks simple and isn't. The fiber source matters. The moisture level of the fibers matters. The twisting technique, the ply ratio, the way you join new fiber lengths smoothly. All of these affect the strength and consistency of your final product. Cordage that fails under load at a critical moment can mean a weapon that breaks, a shelter that collapses, a carrying frame that gives way. Small technical failures cascade into larger practical problems. The complete toolkit of an Upper Paleolithic band represented probably hundreds of distinct technical skills, each requiring practice, each having right and wrong ways of execution, each contributing to the band's overall effectiveness. The cumulative weight of that technical knowledge was immense. No single person carried all of it. It was distributed through the band, with different individuals specializing in different areas while maintaining competence across the common skills everyone needed. Your arrival without this knowledge base meant that everything you needed had to either come from others or be learned under pressure. The learning itself was survival constrained. You were learning to make fire while also needing fire, learning to process food while also needing to eat, learning to produce and maintain tools while the existing tools you'd been given wore out and broke. Every aspect of Stone Age technology was entangled with daily survival in ways that allowed very little margin for the mistakes inherent in learning. Chapter 10, The Long Odds. Adding it all together, let's do something that survival videos rarely do. Let's be honest about the actual odds. You have arrived in the Upper Paleolithic. You have none of the specific skills that Stone Age survival requires. You have none of the physical conditioning. You have none of the local knowledge. You don't speak the language. You are entirely dependent on the generosity and patience of a band that didn't ask for you, and that is operating under resource constraints that make generosity costly. What are your actual chances of surviving one day? 1 week? 1 year? One day is achievable. On day one, you will be cold, hungry, confused, and frightened. You may be injured in minor ways. You will be profoundly disoriented and largely useless to the people around you. But you will probably survive, because on day one, you are not yet responsible for your own survival. You are a burden, but a manageable one. You have not yet encountered the specific crisis that would test your absent skills to their limit. 1 week is harder. By the end of your first week, You will have encountered your first real challenges, and how you've handled them will have started to define your position in the band. If you've been useful where you can be, carrying things, collecting firewood, helping with physical labor, and appropriately humble where you haven't, and if you haven't been injured, and if no illness has taken hold, you might be solidifying your place as a not entirely hopeless addition to the group. 1 week, possible, but the margin is thin. 1 month is where the real attrition begins. By 1 month, the initial shock has worn off, and the genuine difficulty of your situation is fully apparent. Your physical capabilities are improving, but they're still far below what's needed. Your knowledge base is expanding, but the gaps are still enormous. You have had at least one health scare. You have had at least one close call with something dangerous. You have felt the particular despair of being completely dependent on others in a situation where independence is survival. 1 month, roughly 50-50, and that estimate is generous. 1 winter. Getting through your first Stone Age winter from a standing start without the preparation of a full preceding year is where most modern people would fail. The cold, the food scarcity, the physical demands of winter survival with inadequate preparation. These would combine with accumulated physical wear and the compromised immune function of someone who's been chronically underfed and overworked for months. 1 winter, perhaps 1 in 5, and again, generous. But here's the uncomfortable thing about these odds. They improve. Every day you survive, you learn something. Every week, your body adapts a little further. Every month, your knowledge base grows, and your skills develop. The knowledge gap narrows, not to zero, but towards something functional. Your immune system encounters local pathogens and begins to build responses to them. Your feet develop the calluses they need. Your eyes learn to read the landscape. The people who survived in the Stone Age were not extraordinarily lucky. They were trained from childhood, adapted over a lifetime, embedded in social networks that carried knowledge across generations, and deeply familiar with specific landscapes. They were doing something enormously difficult with enormous skill, and that skill was learnable. Not in a day, not in a month, but over the years that Stone Age childhood provided. The tragedy of the thought experiment of dropping a modern person into the Stone Age is not just that you would struggle. It's that you would struggle with something genuinely extraordinary happening around you. The people in your band were doing something remarkable, living fully, thinking deeply, creating art and music and story, caring for each other, navigating a dangerous and demanding world with extraordinary competence. The Stone Age was not a lesser human existence. It was a different one, operating according to different demands and calling on different capacities. And most of those capacities were genuinely impressive. Your presence in that world, as a modern transplant, highlights, by contrast, how far we have traveled from the baseline of human existence. We have built a civilization of extraordinary complexity and accumulated knowledge, and in doing so, we have become increasingly specialized and increasingly dependent on that civilization's infrastructure. Remove the infrastructure, and most of us are revealed as much less capable than our ancestors. Not less intelligent, not less resourceful, but less practiced in the specific forms of survival that defined human existence for the vast majority of our species' history. This is not a criticism. Specialization and interdependence are what make complex civilization possible, and complex civilization has produced genuinely wonderful things. But it means that the romanticized idea of getting back to basics, of returning to a simpler, more authentic mode of existence, involves a reality check that most of us are not ready for. The Stone Age was never simple. It was deeply, sophisticatedly, demandingly complex. It's just that the complexity was distributed differently, outward, into the environment, and into other people, rather than inward into specialized knowledge institutions. Understanding that complexity is understanding something real about who we are and where we came from. Conclusion. You are sitting by the fire on a cool evening somewhere in Ice Age Europe, and for the first time in weeks, you feel something that might, if you're generous with yourself, be called equilibrium, not comfort. Comfort is not on the menu and won't be for a very long time. But equilibrium, settling into the reality of where you are and what it requires of you. You are exhausted in ways you didn't know existed before you got here. Your hands are rougher than they've ever been. Your feet have calluses, building in places you didn't know calluses could form. You can start a fire with a bow drill in under 15 minutes now, which felt like an impossible goal 3 weeks ago, and is still slower than anyone else in your band, but is no longer embarrassing. You know the names of most of the people around you. You understand probably a third of what's being said at any given moment, and some days it feels like more. You are, by any honest measure, nowhere near being able to survive independently in this world. You are still fundamentally dependent on the band, but you are less of a liability than you were, and the people around you have started to treat you less as a curious problem and more as a struggling but genuine member of the group. That shift in treatment feels enormous, because in this world, it is enormous. Social belonging is not a comfort. It is infrastructure. The older toolmaker showed you something new today about pressure flaking. The technique of using a pointed tool to remove tiny flakes from a blade edge to sharpen and refine it. You ruined 3 blades trying it and produced one that was actually usable. She made a sound that might have been approval or might have been the Stone Age equivalent of, well, at least you're trying. Either way, you are counting it. Here is what surviving even this much of the Stone Age has taught you. Or rather, what it would teach you if you were there. That the most important thing you own is not any tool or weapon or garment. It is the knowledge in your head and the relationships in your social world. Both of these take enormous time to build and can be lost in an instant. Both of them are, in the most fundamental sense, what you are. Strip away the knowledge and the relationships, and you are not a human being in any functional sense. You are a lost animal in a world that doesn't know you and doesn't owe you anything. That the modern world's extraordinary success at making survival automatic, at moving the baseline of human existence from daily struggle to assumed background condition, is the greatest achievement in the history of our species, and we should probably be a lot more astonished by it than we are. Running water, reliable food supply, medical care, warm shelter with controllable temperature. These aren't amenities. They are the resolution of the fundamental problems that occupied the full cognitive capacity of our ancestors every single day. We have solved those problems so thoroughly that we've forgotten they were ever problems. And in forgetting, we've lost the ability to appreciate the solution. That our ancestors, the people who actually lived in the Stone Age, who navigated all of the terrors and difficulties we've discussed and survived them well enough to produce descendants, including you, were not primitive or simple or lesser versions of us. They were fully realized, cognitively sophisticated, emotionally complex human beings, doing something extraordinarily difficult with extraordinary skill. The awe that some people reserve for ancient monuments or historical conquests should perhaps be extended to the anonymous, unrecorded people who made it through a Stone Age winter with their families intact. That was a genuine achievement. It deserves genuine respect. That the knowledge gap is the thing that would actually kill you. Not the predators, though they were real. Not the cold, though it was genuine. Not the food scarcity, though it was constant. The predators could be avoided with the right knowledge. The cold could be managed with the right skills. The food could be found by people who knew where to look. What you couldn't survive was attempting all of this without that knowledge and those skills, and without enough time to acquire them before the situation forced the issue. And finally, that surviving in the Stone Age, really surviving, not just enduring for a few weeks before an inevitable crisis, would require you to become a fundamentally different person. Not a better or worse person, but a different one, shaped by different demands, carrying different knowledge, embedded in different relationships, oriented toward different priorities. The you who eventually became functional in the Stone Age would not be quite the same you who arrived there, any more than any person is the same at 50 as they were at 5. The world shapes its inhabitants, and the Stone Age shaped its inhabitants thoroughly. The fire needs feeding. You know where the fuel pile is. You helped build it. You get up, and the movement is less painful than it was a week ago. Small progress. The kind that happens as one unremarkable day at a time, without drama, without the narrative satisfaction of a breakthrough moment, just the slow, grinding, glorious accumulation of capability. The stars are extraordinary tonight. You've noticed that about the Stone Age sky. No light pollution, no haze, just the full, staggering depth of the universe, overhead every clear night. The band treats the stars as navigational tools, as seasonal markers, as characters in stories that carry meaning you're still working to understand. They're not just pretty, they're useful. Everything out here is either useful or dangerous, and sometimes both at once. You add wood to the fire. The flames catch and grow. Somewhere out in the darkness, something large moves through the undergrowth, and then is still again. You watch the darkness for a moment, longer than you would have a month ago, reading it the way you're slowly learning to read it. Then you sit back down. The night is cold. The band is settling into sleep around you. Tomorrow there will be more work, more learning, more of the relentless, extraordinary, utterly unromantic reality of being alive in a world that requires everything you have and then asks for a little more. You are still here. You are still learning. That, in the Stone Age, was the whole game, and against all odds, you were still playing it. But let's be honest with each other, you and I, from the comfortable remove of the 21st century. You wouldn't have lasted the first week, and that's not an insult. That is simply the truth about how far we have traveled from where we came from, and how much we owe, quietly, daily, without fanfare, to every single ancestor who made it through a winter we will never have to face. Now go appreciate your heating system. You've earned it. Bonus chapter: the things nobody talks about. We've covered the cold and the predators and the food and the medicine and the tools, and yet there are several aspects of Stone Age daily life that survival discussions almost always skip over because they're uncomfortable or unglamorous. In the spirit of complete honesty about what you'd be facing, let's address them. Pain as background noise. Modern people experience pain as an event, something that interrupts normal life, demands attention, and gets treated. Stone Age people experienced significant pain as a baseline condition of existence. Dental pain from worn or damaged teeth, joint pain from the cumulative stress of physical labor, muscle soreness so constant it ceased to be noticed, headaches from inadequate sleep, and chronic mild dehydration. The mental and physical energy required to function through continuous low-level pain is something modern people rarely have to develop, and its absence in your experience is another gap between you and the people whose world you've entered. You would spend your first several weeks in a state of physical misery that your body and mind simply aren't adapted to pushing through. The people around you push through it without comment because it is simply the texture of existence. You're going to find that very hard to imitate. Parasites. Intestinal worms were essentially universal in Paleolithic populations, not as an occasional misfortune, as a permanent feature of existence. Roundworms, pinworms, hookworms, tapeworms from undercooked meat. All of these would be with you more or less continuously, competing with your body for the calories you worked so hard to acquire, causing symptoms ranging from subtle nutritional drain to acute illness. Your body, arriving from a modern environment where intestinal parasites are rare, would have a more dramatic initial response than people who had lived with their parasite burden since childhood. The adjustment period is, by all accounts, genuinely unpleasant. Sleep deprivation as the normal state. Research on contemporary hunter-gatherer sleep patterns, the best available proxy for Paleolithic sleep, suggests that people slept in two distinct phases, with a period of wakefulness between them, woke frequently to tend fire and monitor for threats, and generally got less total sleep than modern health guidelines recommend. Chronic mild sleep deprivation degrades cognitive function, immune function, emotional regulation, and physical performance. In a world where all of those things directly affect your survival odds, sleeping badly is not just uncomfortable, it is dangerous, and it is every night. Grief with no distance. In the modern world, death happens mostly at a remove from daily life. Hospitals, nursing homes, the physical and social structures that manage death exist partly to allow most people to live without constant direct encounter with it. In the Stone Age, death was present and immediate. People died in camp. Infants died in their mother's arms. Companions died on hunts. The elderly died through winter. There was no institutional management, no way to not be directly present with it. You would encounter death directly and repeatedly, in ways you are genuinely not prepared for. The grief this produced was real and pervasive. The social and spiritual structures of Stone Age culture, the burial ceremonies, the ritual practices, the storytelling that maintained the presence of the dead in community memory, existed partly to manage this constant reality of loss. You would need those structures before you fully understood them. Boredom and its opposite. Here is a genuine paradox of Stone Age life. It was both relentlessly demanding and, by modern standards, profoundly monotonous. There were no books, no screens, no recorded music, no variety entertainment. There were stories, conversation, music made with available instruments, rich ritual and social life, the full emotional range of fully human beings. There were also long hours of repetitive work, processing hides, knapping stone, grinding plant material, and long evenings by firelight with the same small group of people, the same landscape, visible from the same position day after day. Your modern nervous system is calibrated to expect a level of variety and stimulation that the Stone Age cannot provide. The specific hunger for novelty that modern media has trained into your attention would find no easy satisfaction here. That withdrawal is its own difficulty, layered beneath all the others. Navigation without instruments. Moving through Stone Age landscapes required genuine wayfinding skill. No GPS, no maps, no road signs or landmarks. Beyond those, your knowledge of the landscape could interpret. Stars, sun angle, landscape features, wind patterns, the behavior of animals. All of these were read and integrated to understand where you were and how to reach where you needed to be. Getting lost in the Paleolithic was not an inconvenience resolved by checking your phone. It was a serious crisis that could end in hypothermia, predator encounter, or simple inability to find your way back to camp before nightfall. Modern. People's navigational skills have atrophied dramatically as technology has made wayfinding passive. Rebuilding that capability takes time you may not have. Violence between human groups. The evidence on interpersonal violence in the Paleolithic is genuinely mixed, and debates continue among anthropologists about how common conflict between groups was. But the evidence that exists, skeletal trauma consistent with violence, weapons embedded in bones, burial sites showing signs of conflict, suggests that group-on-group violence was not absent from the Paleolithic world. The causes were likely the same causes that drive conflict at any period of human history. Competition for resources, territorial disputes, accumulated grievances, breakdown of social norms under pressure. Your band's relationship with other groups in the landscape was another navigational challenge. Knowing who was allied, who was potentially hostile, what the protocols were for encounters on disputed territory. Getting this wrong had consequences. This was not a world of universal harmony between human groups, however much we might wish it had been. The absence of privacy. You live in a band of roughly 20 to 30 people. You sleep in a shared space. You work in view of others. You eat communally. Your illnesses, your fears, your mistakes, your moments of weakness. All of these are visible to the people around you, continuously. There is nowhere to be alone, and no cultural valorization of solitude in the way that modern individualist societies provide. Social performance, being seen to contribute, being seen to cope, being seen to maintain your role, is essentially constant. For modern people accustomed to the privacy that personal space and solitude provide. This unbroken social visibility is exhausting in a way that compounds all the other exhaustions. These unglamorous realities don't change the fundamental story, they complete it. The Stone Age was not an experience designed for comfort, and the full picture includes these textures as much as the dramatic ones, the predators and the cold and the food scarcity that survival narratives usually center. All of it together is what you'd be living. All of it together is what your ancestors navigated every single day for tens of thousands of years. And all of it together is what makes the fact that you exist, that any of us exist, a quiet, perpetual miracle that we do not appreciate nearly enough. The fire is warm. The stars are extraordinary in the total absence of artificial light. The whole depth of the universe overhead, used as calendar and compass and story. The people around you, doing something impossibly difficult with remarkable competence and genuine humanity, are more than worth knowing. You are still here. Tomorrow you will try again, and the day after that, and the day after that. Slowly, very slowly, the gap narrows. The world, piece by piece, begins to make sense. That is the whole story of the Stone Age. That is the whole story of us. Now go appreciate your heating system. You've genuinely, deeply earned it.